Welcome back. In Ukraine, that country is trying to celebrate its Independence Day 6 months to the day since the start of the Russian invasion. There's strict curfews in place in some cities. Amid concerns, Russia may try to launch a major strike of some kind. But it's also a moment to take stock of the conflict 180 days since it began. Roland Henwood is a commentator and political scientist at the University of Pretoria. Roland, good afternoon to you. If we just go back to the days before the invasion, Russia had a big build-up of arms, weapons, material, soldiers on the border with Ukraine. It strongly denied that it would invade. When it did invade, at the time, the prevailing Western opinion was that it wanted a quick surgical strike, that it wanted to sort of take Kiev in a week. How would you describe what's happened since then?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, since then it's been a slow grind. It's been a very difficult going for the Ukrainians in the first place, the people who bear the brunt of what is happening. But the Russians have equally been, I think, surprised, have been held back quite efficiently, and has basically been prevented from decapitating, as it was put at the early days, decapitating the leadership in Kiev and basically taking over the country. None of that has happened. What we see is a very slow, grinding conflict, stalled in many places, but basically focusing only on the southern and eastern extremes of the Ukraine at this stage.
Could Russia have known that this would happen? I mean, surely somewhere there was someone who would have been a military planner who would have known a lot about Ukraine. I mean, these two countries were part of the same political unit for many years. There would have been people in Russia, in the military, who would surely have known what Ukraine's capabilities were. They would have been able to predict that this could happen.
Well, it seems that did not happen, and we've seen recently intelligence reports indicating that the Kremlin was not aware of what they were going to meet, and also that there are indications that some of what has been informed in the Kremlin has been lies because people were scared of basically speaking truth to power. And we saw an inclination of that environment early on when Mr. Putin in public humiliated one of his intelligence chiefs because the person did not want to basically follow the argument that he was presenting for the invasion in Ukraine. So it may be partly an intelligence failure, but it also may be a result of the political environment and the politics that seem to dominate and in a sense destabilize efficient decision-making in the Kremlin.
There's so many ways to look at what's happening now, and one way to look at it is to suggest that this is a conflict between the West and Russia, or maybe between the West and Russia's supporters. How do you see it? Is it as stark as that? Is this about Russia and Ukraine, or is it about Russia and the West?
No, it's a complex reality. It started out as Russia and the Ukraine, basically an invasion of a sovereign country, illegal invasion by a neighboring country, and there's clear international law and process to deal with that. What made this more complex was the fact that you're sitting with one of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council that has the ability to essentially prevent the UN from acting by using the veto. So at that level, you look at what's happening in the macro system of international politics. But this has gone beyond merely the Ukraine and Russia, in that NATO and the EU has definitely stepped in much more than anyone would have expected to support Ukraine, but with very clear guidelines and very clear policy decisions that they were not going to get involved directly in the war, but they are not going to support actions that will allow this conflict to spiral out of control, to become a nuclear war. But definitely, probably one can make the case that it is now a war of Ukraine as a proxy of European and NATO interests against Russia mainly, but also those who support Russia, Belarus, China, and so one can look at the number of states that are also essentially supporting what Russia is doing.
There are very clear limits that have so far been sort of obeyed, and let me explain what I mean. There's been no direct action by Ukraine on Russian territory. I understand the very strange explosions on Russian Air Force bases in Crimea. I understand the death of a daughter of a prominent philosopher in Russia. But Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for those things. So that's one limit, you could say, one boundary it's sort of accepted for now. The other is that it is not, as far as I know, there's been no Western weapon, no, let me call it what it is, no American rocket has been fired by Ukrainian forces into Russian territory. And I'm sure that's because the Americans have told the Ukrainians that that mustn't happen. The longer this goes on, it's surely the more likely that these boundaries become blurred or no longer obeyed. What happens then? Does the conflict escalate?
That's the real risk. Maybe on the first issue, NATO, the European Union, America has been very clear that they will not provide long-range weapons that will put Russian soil or territory in the capability of the Ukrainian forces. And there's also a very strong agreement and guideline that the Ukraine may not use the weapons and support it gets to escalate the war beyond its own borders. So in a sense, it's a defensive war on the side of Ukraine. It's not an offensive war. There is a risk of escalation the longer this continues. It depends who becomes the most desperate the quickest. The biggest fear at this stage is the fact that you may find an escalation in conflict where the Russian side, for instance, decides to use, as part of its strategic doctrine, theater-style nuclear weapons. In other words, battlefield nuclear weapons, not massive nuclear strikes across the continent, but very localized use. And that, of course, is going to pose a completely different set of challenges. The other option is one that is not necessarily a direct military action, but a result of military action, and that is damaging nuclear facilities, such as the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, which is the biggest nuclear plant that is under Russian control and is used apparently as a Russian base. So those are the kinds of incidents that may trigger a much bigger conflict, a much more threatening conflict. And the risk of that is real. On the other hand, the war seems to have bogged down in a sense, in very small and very limited allowance for movement. There's no quick and big victories anymore. It's really a grinding war at this stage. And that may, in a sense, make it easier to contain what is happening.
And then there's been a huge amount of conversation around our government's stance. Our government says we're going to remain neutral. We will have the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. We will host him 1 week. Our Defense Minister, Thandi Modise, will go to Moscow for a defense conference the next week. Can we maintain this stance?
We can maintain the stance. I think the question South Africa needs to ask is it defensible, firstly, and secondly, what will the long-term costs to South Africa be? In essence, by not taking a stance, we are condoning a transgression of international law and all the norms of the international system. This is not the kind of thing, I think, that where one can claim to be neutral. And there's a difference between saying I'm not taking sides and I am non-aligned. I think we are blurring the lines in a sense. Effectively, what South Africa seems to be doing is to support what Russia has done through all the actions it is taking. And that, I think, is, in my mind, totally indefensible.
Roland Henwood, thank you very much indeed, a commentator and analyst at the University of Pretoria.